Inspiration for Teachers podcast, bringing you dynamic and inspirational educator interviews. Our fascinating guests share their professional challenges and creative resolutions for success. Discover their workable strategies, ideas, and resources to reach your educational goals. And now your host, Kelly Long.
Welcome to another episode of Inspiration for Teachers podcast. I'm your host, Kelly Long, and I thank you for joining me on the show today. As you know, this episode forms part of the Creativity and Innovation series. What we're looking to do is explore new ideas in education and alternative approaches. So I'm very excited to have my guest on the show with me today, Bethan Baëz-Devine. She is an expert in art therapy, and she's going to explore with us how we can use art therapy to support our challenging students in regards to their behaviour. So welcome to the show, Bethan.
Hi, thank you very much for having me on today.
Oh, I'm so excited. I can't wait to get into this with you, because when I saw it, I was like, wow, this looks really interesting. And my head exploded with all these questions as to how it can really help students. So I can't wait to find out that from you today.
Brilliant. Yeah, no, I'm really excited to be able to share hopefully some knowledge with some teachers out there that might be useful.
Oh, thank you, Bethan. So before we dive into all that exciting stuff, can you just give us some background as to what you have been doing from a professional sphere, how you've been working in education, and what makes you our expert today?
Sure. So I was previously working within the kind of educational sphere as an unqualified teacher, actually in a school, where I was working with some of the most challenging students to try and support them achieve their A star to C GCSEs essentially. And I kind of noticed that I tended to veer towards the more challenging students and kind of built up quite a good rapport with them. So I kind of looked into how maybe I could do that in a different kind of professional capacity. And I researched art psychotherapy and went to Derby University, where I graduated 4 years ago. And since then, I've worked in a variety of settings. So at the moment, I work in child and adolescent mental health services as an art psychotherapist, where I support a variety of young people. My youngest client is 5 up to about 18 on a range of different diagnoses. So from ADHD to OCD, self-harm, suicidal ideation, and essentially kind of trying to give them a support package that is tailor-made for their specific problems. So obviously my main kind of strand is art psychotherapy, but I might use some mindfulness or a bit of DBT, which is dialectical behavioural therapy, and essentially try and create a kind of safe environment for the child or the young person to express themselves. So I do that within CAMS, as I said, and I also do that privately, and I've done various different groups and one-to-one sessions in a variety of schools, from primary to secondary. I also, and that's been in the UK, but I also offer various different packages abroad. So I work with a charity called Worldwide Education Project, where we have done various different field projects. So I've done one in Kakuma refugee camp in Kenya, in Africa, where we supported some of the teachers and students in a psychosocial project to support community cohesion using art psychotherapy in one of the primary schools that they had there, because there was some tribal tension between some of the residents there. So it was to support that as a community. And then I've also offered training, most recently actually, it was actually kind of a Skype training, it was trauma training, again with the same charity, to the volunteer teachers within a refugee camp. And I think what's quite useful is that I'm kind of working both with the students but also with the teachers, because I think it's a community aspect that is most important. And then another project I've got coming up is one in Ghana for a particular school out there, SOS Villages, where they mainly support orphans, and how to support, again, psychosocially, and maybe some of the trauma that might have been through working with the volunteers to support the students. So I suppose I've done a range of working one-to-one with clients, but then also working with teachers and also working with communities.
Wow, Bethan, that just sounds awesome. I can't wait to get into this with you. Wow, that is just, mind-blowing. Brilliant. Okay, so we're going to dive into all of this today in terms of how we can really help students. And I love the way that you said you were really pulled and drawn towards those students with the kind of like most challenging behaviour and needs. And I can't wait to explore that with you. But just before we dive into that, Bethan, I just want to take a moment to thank our sponsors. My Revision Pal is the online revision system for exam success. Many students struggle with revision, getting started, overcoming the mindset barriers, or even knowing what is an effective revision strategy. Students can learn how to pass their exams using My Revision Pal's online revision system. This 6-guided learning module program teaches students how to pass their exams using the 2 scientifically proven and most effective revision techniques. By the end of the program, students will feel more confident, be more focused, and will have the revision skills and systems in place to pass their exams. Right now, students can enrol for free and experience the first learning module. Head over to myrevisionpal.com. That's myrevisionpal.com and sign up to experience your free trial. Okay, so Bethan, we're going to look into art therapy, and when you kind of hear this, or when you hear people talking about it, people get a bit of a fuzzy impression as to what art therapy really is and how useful it can be. So what I really want to get clear on right now is, what is art therapy? How do you define it, and look into how it works? So can you just summarise that for us, please?
I was having this conversation with a colleague recently about what art therapy is, and I think the longer you do it, almost the fuzzier the boundaries become, just in terms of you work with what the client brings you, essentially. But I suppose loosely kind of art therapy, and I'm going to say art therapy because there are a variety of different ones. So obviously my background is ceramics, and so I use kind of, art materials, from obviously clay to painting to drawing to sculpture making. So that's my background, and that's the medium that I feel very comfortable with, having done an art degree previously. But I do have colleagues that do music therapy, drama therapy, dance and movement therapy, and then more recently, which kind of links in with the forest school idea, there's environmental art therapy. So kind of taking some of these ideas outside into nature and using kind of found objects.
Because sorry to interrupt, but I was thinking about this when I was looking at art therapy and thinking about it. I'm a business studies teacher, but I also have an art background myself, and I was thinking, well, could that also be things like photography and stop animation and using ICT ways of creating art? Could it actually be anything? It just comes down to what is the need of the individual.
Yeah, and I think, thank you for kind of bringing that point up. I mean, there's quite a discussion in the field about bringing technology into the art therapy space, and there's sometimes quite a heated debate on either side. I think there's some art therapists that are quite against it, because I think it's because of the confidentiality and the leakage of some of the material. Because, as you know, we both know, social media can be kind of used for great good, but also it can be used for harm. And I think sometimes it's just about having conversations with the young person. If they were to, take a picture of an image that they've created in that space, or an audio clip of some music, that it can be uploaded and the whole world can see it within seconds. And you've obviously created that piece of work in a very contained and trusting and non-judgmental environment, with obviously the therapist jointly. Whereas when you put it out into a wider forum, you won't have that safety necessarily. But I think there are lots of art psychotherapists that enjoy using IT and enjoy using different types of kind of technology to be able to enable that expression. Because I think, especially as children get older, they start to be quite fearful about drawing, about painting, and often if they haven't necessarily had the opportunity to play, and I think we kind of take it for granted that all children have had the same upbringing, that they've had a kind of stable kind of environment where they've been able to explore through play, and parents have been available, and in terms of kind of both physically but also emotionally to be able to support them. And then often when we get them into the art therapy room, they struggle to be able to access that play because actually they've never been modelled it at the beginning. So when we kind of use the art, the creativity, it's about getting back down to a kind of a deeper level, to almost to support regression, because sometimes the challenges that they bring to the education environment may have come from a trauma that they had experienced when they were 2 or 3. So you won't be necessarily seeing a 15, 16-year-old at that time of challenging behaviour. You'll actually be seeing a 2 to 3-year-old, because that might be where they've experienced a problem.
Wow. So it's definitely a form of expression.
Yeah.
And it's using that form of expression to delve into what the challenge is, what it is that the individual needs. Is that right? Yeah.
And I think often, I suppose coming back to the definition of what art therapy is, in terms of a treatment model, it is kind of can be non-verbal, which I think is most important. So this is where I suppose it kind of trumps the kind of verbal therapy. So if you've got a client that is struggling to talk about what they, the problems that they're experiencing, a kind of maybe a traditional counsellor type approach wouldn't necessarily be useful for them, because they really don't have the words, because either, again, as I said, the trauma might have happened when they were quite a lot younger and they didn't have the words, or they're just struggling to be able to express it verbally. But also we know that trauma is stored in the left side of our brain, and that's where we are creative. So actually inviting them to create around the problem and then talk about it afterwards, and the talking part is the right side of the brain, you actually get a truer picture of what that problem might be.
Do you know, it's really fascinating that you're saying that, because I was in some training recently and it was all to do with language, and that the whole process you have to go through in order to understand a problem, find the words to express what it is that you need to say. And there's obviously a model to it. And the lady that was giving us the training, it was really fascinating. She said she had a child that just couldn't speak, and they didn't know what the problem was for her to speak. So somewhere in that model of communication, there was a breakdown. There was something that wasn't working. And she just said to her, well, can you draw me a picture? What is the problem? Just, she'd never tried anything like that before. It just popped into her head. And this child drew peaks and troughs, like all along the page, and a little picture of her falling down the troughs and then climbing up and then falling down. And it was on and on and on and on. And when they said to her, what is it? She quite clearly said, and spoke very clearly, she said, this is how it feels to speak.
Mm.
And you just think, wow, out of all those sessions that she's had with that child, that's the clearest method of communication that she got from her, just by asking her to draw a picture as to what it felt like for her to speak. And you just think that speaks volumes. And then obviously they were allowed to kind of go back and explore it, and she was able to move her forward. So I think, art is a really powerful way of helping somebody to communicate and express how they're feeling.
Oh, completely. And imagery kind of transcends any kind of language barrier, and this is something that I find useful in the various different countries that I work in, even if we don't necessarily always share the common tongue, as it were. There's a kind of art is another type of language that you can kind of both access. So either if it's because you don't kind of physically kind of speak the same language, or because that particular child doesn't have those words to be able to express what's going on, and being able to essentially kind of pour an image out onto a page or into a sculpture or through a bit of clay. And also it's not just necessarily about the end product within art therapy, it's also very much about the process. So often I'll have teachers, and I have had teachers come to me and say, this particular child's drawn this picture, what does it mean? And I think sometimes that can be difficult taking it out of context. Often when I'm with a child, I'll be witnessing and watching how they're using the materials. Why is it that they chose that particular colour? Why is it that they engaged with the material in that particular way? Because it's also about a sensory element. It's about touch. It's about smell. It's about kind of looking. It's about hearing. Sometimes, artwork makes sounds, how does that relate to how they're feeling? And sometimes it can be, a crack of a bit of clay, and that will spur a conversation on that we just wouldn't have had if we were just talking.
So you said that it's very much about the individual, and you build a support package around them, but there might be some barriers that an individual might face when they come to do this with you, which is, when people very quickly define what they're good and what they're not good at. So when you say, oh, well, you can do music therapy, or you can do art therapy or drama therapy, instantly someone could go, I'm not very good at that. And then that could heap a lot more pressure on them and maybe increase, if they're feeling anxiety, the level of anxiety that they've got. So how do you break down that initial barrier? Because obviously it's the expression that you're looking for to then have the communication about what's going on. But instantly a child could just go, whoa, no, this is a whole nother thing that I do not want to have to get my head round.
Yeah, and that is a challenge that is faced. I think it was Pablo Picasso that said all children are artists. The struggle is to remain artists as they grow up. And I think, that's something I talk to teachers about, because we are naturally creative beings. If you go to primary schools, they'll most kids, will naturally engage in that creative process. But it's that kind of hitting that kind of teenage barrier is often where you find more kind of self-criticism and shame and judgment start to be kind of, unfortunately, kind of follow them through. And so when they come into the art therapy room and there's an array of art materials, and often that can be quite scary, it can be scary to be with a therapist anyway. But then added to the fact, if you're not good enough, or the feelings of not feeling good enough, how do you overcome that? But that can also be a starting point in itself, because I'll explore with them, what is it that they're finding challenging about being in this room? Maybe when was the last time that they felt, judged or shamed by a particular experience, or not feeling good enough? And actually that can be a really good starting point to be able to use that point as an expression. And sometimes it will take certain clients a little longer. We might need to talk it through. We might need to be able to curate that safe place verbally before we start getting into the art and into the expression, because the last thing that you want is to kind of it to be a punitive process and it to be kind of adding to the problem. And I think any type of therapy is a lot about timing. Often you'll find kind of adults say, I really think this child needs some support, and it's not until you kind of start working with that client that actually that they get to decide that. That might not be the right time for them. And I've had referrals where, I've seen a client for a couple of sessions and they've said, actually, I'm not okay with this at the moment. And so that's fine. And so I said, well, my door's always open. If you would like to come back, then you can. And often they do, maybe 4-6 months down the line, they'll remember that they've had that kind of experience and then come back later.
So when we're talking about challenging students in terms of I guess it's their behaviour that is the challenge, that they're not coping with something. How does the art therapy really benefit them? I mean, what does it specifically do that an alternative form of therapy couldn't do for them?
Okay. I suppose I kind of often hear the term, kind of the problem child or the challenging child. And I think often in a way, I'm actually pleased that their behaviour is being noticed, because although it might be a problem for the adults around them, and it can be, I've worked in education, it's difficult to have a class of 30 students and you've got 1 or 2 students that maybe are causing, a learning disruption for not only the teacher, but for the students around them. But it's a solution for the child, because it's the only way that they can say that I'm not okay. I'm not all right with this. I need some support. And they may not, as we've said, have the words to express that. So it needs to come out in certain types of behaviour. So be that kind of, aggression or, extreme sadness or, whatever it might be. And I think, again, coming back to anger, which obviously kind of can be a challenge for both the teachers and the pupils around them. I think sometimes anger can be misinterpreted, especially in this is a bit not necessarily kind of gender stereotype, but just what I've seen anecdotally, is that anger can actually be a bit of a gatekeeper to sadness. But I think with boys especially, they might struggle to express that because, it's not okay to be upset as a boy. It's not okay to show that vulnerability. So I need to guard myself by kind of being angry. And so it's that often kind of gets picked up in a referral, that this particular, child is an angry child. But actually, if you have the time to kind of spend with them in terms of getting down to what the core problem is, often it's a loss, it's a bereavement, it's a feeling of not feeling worthy enough, and because they struggle with that vulnerability, they don't feel safe enough. That's when the anger, I suppose, that's when you see the anger point. I think the students that I worry about the most are the ones that get lost between the cracks of the system in terms of not being noticed, the invisible child, the one that sits in the corner of the room that you don't hear, because it's them that are still struggling with certain aspects, but they're not necessarily kind of being picked up as much. Whereas with the kind of stereotypically challenging students that I'm sure a lot of your listeners can think of, I'm sure one is coming to their head right now, they're giving you a clear message that something isn't okay. And so I think when they come into the art therapy room, I would invite them to explore that anger. What does it mean? How is that behaviour helping them? I mean, it's helping them by the fact that they've actually got into the art therapy room. They've got that support. How is it not helping them? And I think, we explore different kind of, I suppose, kind of behavioural strategies with certain students. So, and I think any kind of therapy is about giving a client a choice. So they know if they behave in a particular way, it has a certain outcome. Whereas if we break down that behaviour and use that time as a reflective time, then they can think about, well, if I did it slightly differently, that's a bit scary because I don't know what the end product is, but it might be slightly better than what I'm doing before. So it's about giving them, I suppose, different options. And through the creativity, it's a much gentler process, and it's also very much more kind of, I suppose, can be client-led in terms of you follow them about what they want to talk about. So again, you might get a referral about, they've had a recent bereavement, and actually that's not what they want to talk about. They want to talk about the fact that they're having problems with their friends. And I think it's just about giving them that really open, non-judgmental space to talk about things that they might struggle to talk about with their teachers, because, teachers don't necessarily have the time or the availability to be able to have that conversation. They don't necessarily want to talk about it with their parents for another variety of reasons. They might feel shamed about talking about it with their friends. So it's just giving them that very non-judgmental, neutral space to explore any difficult feelings that they might have, that they really don't feel they have anywhere else to go. And I think the key point is just being able to have a time to reflect, because I think, as human beings, we go through the day and we get an emotional response to something and we'll have an instant reaction. And then sometimes we'll feel kind of bad about that instant reaction, but we won't always necessarily have the opportunity to think, how could I've done that differently? How could I have managed that situation or spoken to that person in a different way? And I think those students that often don't have a good, especially kind of a parental model. So if they don't have good attachments with their parents and they can't go home and have those difficult conversations, they need to have them somewhere, and they can have them within that art therapy space.
I find this really, really fascinating. I was listening to an audiobook recently called Insanely Gifted, and the author was talking about how, and it struck me when you were talking about how a child's behaviour can very much be linked back to when they were 2 or 3 and the trauma that happened back then. But in this book, it was saying that we have all these characters that we develop that at some point were very useful to us. They helped us in some way, and yet we carry them all the way through our lives. And there becomes a point where actually it's not helpful for us to have that character anymore. It's quite a destructive character in our lives, and it can sabotage us, but we don't have the skills in order to move ourselves forward or recognize that actually that's happening in the first place, and then change the outcome. So I like how you said that you explore it through a gentler and softer approach to what could be the cause for those reasons as to why they're generating a certain response.
And I think, as you quite keenly pointed out, we don't always necessarily recognise when it's happening. And I think this isn't just with children. I know adults where this happens, and you rightly said they take this through the rest of their lives. So it's just about giving them, and often I suppose kind of coming back to my point about kind of attachment styles, if they've not been given a good role model, as it were, to kind of behave in a particular situation, or kind of crisis management essentially, and their parents haven't been able to kind of emotionally regulate them, then they're going to struggle with that. And I think they need, and often, I kind of look back on some of the work that I've done with certain clients, and it's even just giving them a different model, a different way of exploring, how to kind of to talk and how to respond, as opposed to instantly react, which they've just not seen before, and they have another way or another kind of attachment style to be going, oh yeah, but I remember when we were in art therapy and I was talking to my art therapist about this particular challenge, and actually they responded to it in this way. And they can use that as a model and almost like a template. So when they come across another difficult situation, then they've got two options. They can either potentially, as I said before, go to their go-to option, which is, they may have learned through parents, or the option of, when I was with my therapist, I spoke about it in this way, and actually that generated a slightly better response. I might try that one.
So I'm just thinking here, Bethan, I mean, you get obviously referrals because you work in CAMHS, and you're obviously dealing with a range of kind of challenging behaviours and needs and what sits behind that. But I was just thinking, is there anything that we can learn from you from a teaching point of view? I mean, can we take art therapy into our lessons? Can it be useful in that way? And if so, what would you recommend as a way in which teachers can use it to, assist in their subjects, but allow their children and their learners to, develop more?
I think that's a good point that you bring up, and I suppose one thing with the professional art therapies is it's a protected title. So obviously you need to be registered with Healthcare Professionals Council in order to practice. So it's not something that you can just kind of pick up and do. However, I do go through with some of the teacher workshops that I do about, I suppose, some kind of takeaway tips. And I suppose it's quite useful when I'm in a kind of workshop, is that I'll often get teachers say, well, I've got this particular child, and for example, okay, something I had recently was this particular boy liked to kind of constantly kind of fiddle with blue tack or doodle. Often I get a lot of teachers saying, it really irritates me when so and so doodles. It's like they're not listening. And actually, for that particular child, they might have just so much energy that they need to be able to almost kind of leak a bit out onto a page, or kind of hold a bit of blue tack or fiddle with something in order to be able to really engage with the verbal side. Because I suppose, as I said before, the left side and the right side of our brains are used for different things. And so if they are being kind of activated on the left side of the brain, so if they're doodling or if they're playing with a bit of blue tack, then actually the right side of the brain is being able to engage in a slightly different way. So it's almost like it's different techniques for different classes. But I think one of the things that I would say, and something else that I'm quite I do some workshops in, is teacher self-care, because I think teaching is quite a difficult profession, and I think it's getting harder. And I think when these teachers are faced with challenging students, it's just another level of stress that they're having to be able to deal with. So I think one of the things that we talk about also is how can they kind of model a particular type of behaviour for their students? What would be useful for them? So for certain teachers, they might do a couple of minutes mindfulness before the beginning of the lesson, or they might have a check-in time. For other teachers, they might have a kind of corner of the room where they have a bit of a kind of a safe place, like a timeout zone, where if they do have particular challenging students that need to spend a little bit of time just, self-regulating, which they might find a bit difficult. They might need 10 to 15 minutes just to be able to calm down after a particular incident, because actually that's how long it takes for the body for certain students to kind of absorb the cortisol that's running through their system. So it can be, I suppose, tailor-made to to the teacher and to the environment and to who they're working with. But I think one of the biggest things that I talk to teachers about, I suppose, going back, is just their self-care, because if they can look after themselves, then they can support the emotional regulation of their students.
I definitely agree with that. And it's why I did the mindfulness and well-being series a couple of months back. I think it's really important for teachers to look after themselves. And it's really interesting that you were saying that, because I was thinking the other day, my husband sent me a message of something that he'd found on Twitter, and it was a quote, and it said, teachers make more minute-by-minute decisions than brain surgeons, and that's why you're going home every day so exhausted. And you just think, yep, that's probably why I need so many breaks.
Yeah, exactly. And I think going back to attachment, is that often, if students do have challenging home situations, actually they're going to school for a break. They're going to school because they've got a good connection with a particular teacher. And it's like they're teachers are kind of like frontline staff in terms of a lot of the material, a lot of the challenging material that they're getting, and it's day in, day out, and it can be quite kind of, extremely tiring. And so where do they take that? Where do they take the opportunity to check in with themselves, and kind of to restore their kind of well-being? And I think if they can kind of find those places, which I'm sure are getting even harder with the pressure, then I think that would kind of in turn automatically support the students that they're with, because they're not they won't necessarily be reacting as quickly to a particular incident, but responding. And I suppose there's a very different way of approaching those two aspects.
You definitely have to be able to recognise those signs, because I know definitely at the end of coming up to Easter and that last week, I've got coursework that I've got to do, I've got exam prep that I've got to do, and all the kids are wanting something from me. And I remember at one point in my classroom thinking, deep breath, because I am so tired, and yet you guys all need me to do stuff and help you, and I need to, but I just need to take a breath here right now, because otherwise I might just crack.
Yeah, and I think, I'm sure you've probably seen this quote before. It's something like, in terms of mindfulness, if you haven't got any time to do it, you probably need to do it even more.
Oh yeah, definitely. I agree with you. So I think that's been really interesting, Bethan, in terms of, really delving into that and looking at what are the issues. And I find it absolutely fascinating as to what you've just taken us through. But if you were going to, help our listeners further, and if they wanted to explore it in a bit more detail, what books could you recommend in order to help them on their journey?
Sorry, well, something that I do recommend teachers, which is very kind of classroom based, is Heather Geddes, which is attachment in the classroom. So that will give them more of an understanding in terms of maybe why students might behave the way they do, both in the classroom but also with them. And I think there's something about the teacher recognizing that they also bring something to that relationship. So it might be that one student kind of, is kind of behaves, in a particular way in one classroom, but with them it's completely different. That will kind of explore a little bit about maybe kind of why that is and what they can do in order to support that. So I think that would be the first book. If they wanted to know more about art therapy, David Edwards writes really eloquently and very succinctly about the process of art therapy in a bit more detail. And it's just Creative Therapy in Practice, art therapy book, which, I would recommend if they wanted to find out more. But also, one of my other hats is I'm a regional coordinator for the British Association of Art Therapists. And so that's the BAT website. So it's just BAAT. If you just put that into Google, they'll bring the BAT website up. And essentially that just has a bit more information, if they were interested in going on a short day course about art therapy, or just wanting to find out a bit more about the profession as a whole. And so that's just art therapy. Music, drama and dance and movement have their different organisations. So that's purely art therapy.
So we'll put all of that on the show notes page at the website inspirationforteachers.com. You can go there and you can find Bethan's podcast and all of the resources that she's recommended today. So please do go there and visit. I think I quite like to do a half-a-day workshop. Yeah. It sounds amazing.
Yeah, thank you.
So, Bethan, thank you so much for joining me on the show today. It's been really insightful and so valuable, and I really love this. I'd love to just talk even more about it. So we'll probably have to get you back on the show and go into it in a bit more detail and maybe explore a few more case studies at some point in the future. But before we say goodbye, how can our listeners connect with you?
Okay, so I'm on LinkedIn, so you can find me just Bethan Baëz-Devine, and I'm also on Twitter at @Bethan.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Bethan. It has been wonderful speaking with you today.
Thank you so much, Clay.
Thank you for joining us today on Inspiration for Teachers. For more resources, tips and advice, visit our website, inspirationforteachers.com. If you enjoyed today's episode, we would love to connect with you. Just click like on our Facebook page at facebook.com/inspirationforteachers.